We're going to learn about responsive web design. All right, so my basic setup here, I'm in my demos folder, just got a main CSS file, empty index.html, empty notes. So we're starting from scratch here. But first of all, let's define some terms, make sure we're clear on what we're talking about. What is responsive web design? So I would define that as an approach to building websites in which various aspects of the website respond to various aspects of the user's device to show them a more appropriate version of the website. So going to try to give you the most important bits up front. Most commonly, responsive web design is about adapting to the width of the user's device. There are a lot of differences between laptops, desktops, mobile devices, whatever, but most commonly, when we're talking about responsive web design, we're talking about making a layout that looks reasonable at multiple different widths for devices. So aside from the screen size, some other considerations that you need to think about as a part of responsive web design are the device's capabilities. So some devices might not have touch screens. Some users won't have a mouse and keyboard. Some browsers don't even have JavaScript. So broadly speaking, there are two different approaches to responsive web design, depending on whether you're primarily targeting larger, fully featured devices or smaller, more limited devices. So what I think is the more common and potentially better approach is called progressive enhancement. You might have heard this term before. It's a style of responsive web design in which you design primarily for the smallest, most limited devices. So that would be a touch screen without a mouse and keyboard. And then you gradually add non-essential features for larger screens. Ivan?
In your preference, or like at least in your experience, has it always been easier to go smaller than bigger, or is it just like I just like it that way? Kind of sense.
I mean, basically, whichever users you think of first are going to have the better experience. So if you design it initially to look decent on a mobile phone, it's not like having extra space is going to make it look terrible. It just looks like there's a lot of extra space that maybe you didn't use optimally. But if you start out the other way and you design a site that only works on desktop where you have like, a 4K monitor or whatever, it's going to be really hard to think about what you can cut out of that to make it still usable on a mobile device if you designed it for a large screen to begin with. So just to make sure that your website is usable for everyone, I think it's important to focus on the smallest, least capable devices first. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So yeah, if we think that the user is able to handle it, we will gradually add non-essential features. So like a less compressed layout, if they have a really wide screen, just makes it easier to read, but maybe doesn't actually present new or different information. If the user has a mouse, you can have hover states for your elements. So that like gives you more information about what you can interact with when you hover over it. Now, ideally, your website shouldn't depend on hover states to provide information or to do other things, because users on touchscreen devices can't activate hover states because they can only click on things basically. But you can use it informationally to add some non-essential information. So for one example of that, I want to take a look at LinkedIn. So I just made a new LinkedIn page here. This is my personal profile. So I just made the window as small as it'll be, as small as I can make it. So this should kind of emulate like a mobile layout as if I was viewing this on my phone. And so let's look at what we've got, especially in the nav bar here. All of the items don't fit in the nav bar, so it's a little bit unfortunate. We have to use this little ... here to get the extra icons that don't fit in here, like the try premium for free, which is very important. Can't leave that out. Not trying to post. All the icons here don't have any text underneath them, so it's a little bit hard to know exactly what they do. Especially this search button here is kind of weird. It doesn't really do what I expect it to. Like, I don't know, some of these I expect to take me to different pages, or I guess actually a lot of these just pop out widgets. No, this one takes me to a different page. This one is a little pop-up. So actually all these buttons are kind of inconsistent. But anyway, this is not exactly what I expect a search bar to look like. Just kind of like that. But let's see, as I expand my browser, how the layout changes a little bit. Because currently we do have all the minimum features for this website to be usable. Technically I can access everything I want with a couple of extra clicks. And if I know what these buttons do, I can use them. But as I expand out, come on. So here we've hit a breakpoint just being a specific width at which your layout changes. So here we hit a breakpoint, the layout changes. We no longer have the 3 dots for these extra items that didn't fit, because now everything fits in the nav bar. As we continue expanding outwards, at this point, there's another breakpoint where we added more margin in between the icons just to make them easier to click on. Because if you have a whole bunch of clickable things really close together and you're trying to tap them with your thumb, you've got big hands or whatever, it's really easy to click on the wrong thing. So since there's extra space here, they add a small enhancement of spacing out the buttons a little more. As we increase the layout even wider, it adds text underneath the buttons. So this is a trade-off that you have to consider when you're designing a nav bar. There are basically 3 ways you can have links: either text-only links, or icon-only links, or combined icons with text under them. So all of these have trade-offs. Text is the most clear, but it's hardest to see like quickly at a glance if you're already very familiar with the system. Icons are very easy to see quickly, but if you're not already familiar with what they do, it's a little bit harder to use, hard to figure out what they do. So the most clear option and the fastest option for recognition is to combine them, having the icons with the text underneath, but then that has the trade-off of taking up the most screen space. So LinkedIn is trying to kind of get the best of all those worlds, and they're using this more expensive option, putting the text underneath the icons that takes up the most screen space, but they're only doing this when they have extra screen space. So they're adding that enhancement, that minor enhancement progressively as the viewport gets a little bit wider. Let's see, so also changes. At this point, we get a 2-column layout. The main content is in the middle, and then there's this little sidebar with other options, navigation or whatever. As I expand it even more, I get a 3-column layout. This ad that was below my feed pops over to the side. If I actually had more of a feed, yeah, there we go. Okay, so I think this is kind of interesting because when I actually have stuff in my newsfeed, that ad just isn't visible at all. And so as the screen gets wider, that's actually a progressive enhancement. They add this advertisement in. And then also this little news sidebar. I honestly feel a little bit sad for the person, the engineer who designed this sidebar over here, because I'm sure they put a lot of time and effort into it, but it's like the first thing that gets hidden from the screen if the user's device is not quite big enough. So all that time and effort can just easily be unnoticed because people are using tablets or phones. Andrew, did you raise your hand?
I have a question about website design for like mobile users. Do sometimes sites link mobile users to like a different version of their site entirely?
They do. I would like to discourage you from doing that. I think that's not a very modern practice. So you're talking about like m.wikipedia.org. Oh, that didn't even work. That just redirected me back to the regular Wikipedia. So I guess it used to be the case that Wikipedia had multiple separate websites. They had the desktop version that was not mobile friendly at all. And then they had m.wikipedia.org, which was the mobile version of the site. So I feel like this was common more in the mid 2000s. You would see a lot of m. sites for the mobile version of it, whatever, and they would try to detect what kind of device you were using, try to detect if you're using a phone or a laptop, and then send you to the right version of the site. There are reasons why this is kind of buggy. Generally, like certain phones will pretend like they're actually laptops or desktop computers because they want to receive the desktop version of the site because they think that they can automatically scale it to look reasonable. So there's kind of this like cat and mouse game between mobile browsers and like servers, where mobile browsers want to pretend like they can consume the full desktop version of the site, and the servers want to send the mobile version of the site to mobile browsers, regardless of what they say. So yeah, that was kind of a mess. Also, you just have to maintain 2 websites, which is extra work. So instead of doing that, more contemporary responsive web design techniques focus on just adapting to the width of the device, which is all I'm talking about today. So yeah, if they visit on a small device, it should adapt with all the responsive techniques I'm teaching you. If they have a device that's somewhere in the middle between a phone and a desktop computer, these techniques should also work for that. So you don't have to have like exactly 2 versions of your website, mobile and desktop. You can have kind of a sliding scale that meets the needs of everyone in between. Does that answer your question? Might have been more than you were asking for.
No, that's exactly what I wanted. I just wanted kind of like the backstory behind like if it existed or not.
Okay. Yeah, backstory is good to know about, I think, because a lot of things in the web just like don't really make any sense if you're learning about them today. But if you understand like, oh, like the last year people were dealing with this and this was an improvement on that or a reaction to that, you can kind of understand how we got to where we find ourselves today. Where are we? Looking at LinkedIn here. So yeah, I'm just showing you how, as the screen gets wider, they progressively add other little features, other kind of UI enhancements to show me more information, add more navigation, just make the icons easier to read. Also, another little enhancement for mouse and keyboard users is I can hover over a lot of items on this page. So like I wouldn't automatically assume that these items are clickable here, these little news things, but since they highlight when I hover over them, that kind of gives me a clue that it's an interactive element. And so I can click on it, and sure enough, it takes me to this other page, some news articles, great. So that's nice that I get this extra information. You know, everything that I hover over tells me that it's clickable. Unfortunately, mobile users don't get this information, but it's non-essential, so that should be okay. Now, the flip side of progressive enhancement is called graceful degradation. Where basically you design your website for the most powerful, most fully featured devices, and then you find some way to gracefully make it, you know, worse for devices that can't actually handle the full experience. So one example I could think of is like if you're building a dashboard that lets users edit a lot of their data, you know, like a huge table with lots of rows of items, and there's like buttons in each row to edit each item. That probably works really well on a desktop computer when you have a mouse and keyboard and you can precisely click on small buttons, but it's probably really hard to work with on a mobile device. So I've seen some web apps where on the same web page, when you visit it on a desktop computer, you can view and edit your data, but the same dashboard viewed from a mobile phone only lets you view your data because there's just not enough space on the screen for all the editing UI. So that would be a graceful degradation, I suppose. It does make you lose some functionality, but as much of it as possible is still usable to you. Another common and probably simpler example of graceful degradation that I can show you real quickly is the no script JavaScript or the no script HTML element. So what this does is it's essentially like a div, but the contents inside of a no script element will only render if the user is not using JavaScript. So either their browser doesn't support it entirely, or they've disabled it for, you know, ethical, moral, privacy reasons, whatever. So let me just show you that real quick. So I'll just put an H1 here first of all, just so we know that something is actually loading. And then no script. We'll open a terminal, start up a server right here. Cool, so that's running on port 8000. So I'm going to go to my browser, localhost 8000. All right, so here's my big header, but we're not seeing the no script content. If I inspect the page, go to the Elements tab, so we can see it's in the HTML, but it's not rendered on the page because I'm using JavaScript. So we want to test how this actually works. I'm going to go to my settings here, click that little gear, and then under, where is it? Under debugger, I'm going to click Disable JavaScript. So now I can test how my browser works if it just refuses to run JavaScript on any page. So now page looks a little different. The no script element is actually rendering. We can see it's got dimensions. So this is a pretty simple example of graceful degradation. Now, ideally, you should use the no script tag to include a full text or a plain text version of your website, so people who don't have JavaScript can still access the content. More commonly, the no script tag is just used to tell users that they need JavaScript and that they can't access the website. Kind of like this. So it's a little bit unfortunate, but at least instead of getting nothing, they get some information that tells them why it's not working. So this is honestly a technique that I've had to use more than a couple times. I like making just kind of wacky apps that use weird device capabilities, like accelerometers or like microphones or MIDI input. So like oftentimes if your device, doesn't have an accelerometer in it, then the app just doesn't work at all. So I'll have like a quick check in JavaScript if the accelerometer gives me any data at all. And if not, I'll tell them like, hey, this app is not going to work on your device. Try using a phone or a laptop with an accelerometer or something. So sometimes that's the best you can do, but at least you told the user more than nothing. They have some idea of why the app isn't working. All right, any questions about these terms, progressive enhancement, graceful degradation? No?
I have a question, but it's unrelated to that.
Let's hear it.
What's the difference between using localhost and just opening the file in your browser?
So using localhost like this, I'm actually serving the file over the HTTP protocol. And so in a few ways, it behaves a little bit more closely to how your actual application is going to run in production. So there are going to be fewer surprises if you start off like this when we actually get to running our apps in production. You can just open it with file, like just use the Finder, double click on it, and it'll open in your browser. That also works. But then you'll see in the top left corner, like file : // So your browser knows that it's just reading the file off your local machine. So that causes it to like relax certain security rules, and also makes your URLs work a little bit differently. So just to like avoid having to like adapt and just avoid having to think like, well, it worked in development, but it didn't work, in the live site or whatever. I just try to get my local environment to be as similar as possible to like a real actual server. This isn't like tremendously important. So if you want to run an HTML, CSS file some other way, that's probably fine. But this is generally how you're going to see me running even simple HTML files in this class.
Okay,
Sound
thank
good?
you.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, let's put a little more text here. So let me re-enable JavaScript here real quick. Okay, so looking at this in my gigantic laptop screen, this looks like a pretty decent website. I can read it, but I want to have some idea how this is going to look on a mobile device, not just a small screen, but specifically like a phone. So before you just saw me making the screen really narrow, and that's one quick way to test how this looks on narrower screens. A slightly better way that we can test this out is using the built-in device emulator in DevTools. So just to the left of the Elements tab, there's this little icon here. It kind of looks like a phone in front of a larger screen. So this is the device toolbar. I clicked on that. And so now this is showing me how my website would look on a mobile device. And I don't know about you, but I think this is completely illegible. I can like maybe barely read the word header or this, but this is just way too small for me to read. And it kind of surprises me because this is different from how it looked on my desktop site. So I'm going to toggle this off again real quick. This is pretty big readable text. When we go to the mobile version here, I actually zoomed out and set this to 100% zoom. It's still really much smaller than it looked on the desktop version. So this is the first problem we're going to have to solve when we're building a website that's supposed to look good on phones. So let me just explain a little more backstory about what this problem is, why we're seeing this. The issue here is that mobile browsers were invented before mobile websites. So there was a period of time when web developers were just assuming all users had, full screen monitors, whatever. And they were building websites assuming that you had at least 800 pixels wide. And then people started getting phones with browsers in them, and they wanted to be able to consume these websites designed for desktop computers. So these mobile browsers would automatically scale down the content, because normally, there's no way you can fit content for 800 pixel wide screen into a 400 pixel wide phone. So it would automatically just cut everything in half so it fit on the phone. But now, if we are actually deliberately designing our website to look good on a phone, we don't need the automatic scaling because we're using these responsive techniques that I'm talking about today in order to make it look good at a variety of sizes. So the automatic scaling that phones do, which is what you're seeing here, doesn't actually help us render our responsive sites on different devices. It just makes the text look small. So thankfully, there's an HTML tag that we can use which controls this behavior, which prevents cell phones from scaling the content so that it looks more consistent across devices, and it's going to look more like how we expect based on what we develop. So honestly, this is something I forget the specifics of pretty commonly. So I'm just going to Google for responsive meta tag. The very first link that comes up is an article from CSS Tricks. I really love this blog. I think it's a really great resource for CSS. CSS is kind of hard to learn because you don't learn about it in universities. There aren't really textbooks on CSS. A lot of online resources are really shallow and not very technical. They don't fully properly explain how and why CSS works. Whereas I feel like I have definitely gotten a much better understanding of CSS from reading this guy's blog. And it's not that like I seek it out, but just every time I Google a CSS question, this guy's blog is what shows up. And he always has correct and concise solutions that make me feel like I understand CSS better. So anytime you're Googling for a CSS question and this guy's blog comes up in the results, you should be happy and trust that he's got a good answer for you. This article in particular is very short. It basically just shows you the one thing that I wanted to show you here, which is this is what the most common responsive meta tag looks like. So this is not rendered content that the user sees. We don't put this in the body. We're going to put this in the head. And this basically sets extra options for the web page. This is essentially saying that the width of the screen should be the same as the width of the device, and that you should not scale the content at all. So don't do anything fancy, just render the content normally. I kind of wish this was the default behavior, but it's not. So I'm going to paste in this responsive meta tag. Go back to my website, turn off the device simulator, refresh the page. And when I turn on the device simulator again, now the text is much bigger. So you can see this header text covers a much larger proportion of the screen. It goes like 80% of the way across the screen, whereas in the desktop version, it's like 10% across the screen, because the same size text on a smaller screen takes up a larger proportion of the screen. So this is what I would have expected. This is my intention in setting that responsive meta tag. So definitely, if you don't have that one meta tag, it's really hard to do anything that makes your website look good on mobile. So that's definitely a starting point. I think it's worth noting that there are some other settings you can have in the responsive meta tag to control the scaling behavior. One thing I see people fiddle with sometimes is user scalable. On lots of phones, you can like pinch to zoom on a website if you actually want that scaling behavior to have the website not fit the borders of your phone's browser, but actually zoom in, see something a little better. If you want, you can disable that so users cannot zoom in on your phone. People say that that's an accessibility issue, that people who have poor vision or whatever can't use your site then if you don't let them zoom in. So in general, I would like to discourage you from setting user scalable to anything. But sometimes, like, if you're making some kind of like interactive game or art or whatever that requires lots of touch interactions, you might need to disable user scalable just so it doesn't scale your website automatically when users are just touching it. All right, so that's the most commonly used responsive meta tag. You absolutely need to have this in your head starting out if you want it to be usable at all in mobile browsers. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about responsive units. So for the most part, when we've been setting sizes for things, we've been using fixed units like pixels. There's also centimeters, and you can do CSS inches. I don't know why you would want to, but there are other fixed units other than px in CSS. So these are simple and easy to work with, but they don't help us make a responsive website. So I want to talk about some other units we can use for sizing elements that are not actually fixed values, but they change in response to something else that's on your screen. So before I actually just give this away, can anyone think of a responsive unit, something that we can use for measuring widths or height, aside from pixels, that changes in response to something else that's going on the screen?
Is it Rem? Is it one of them?
Viewport,
Percent, rem, viewport something, what was that?
viewport, VP.
VP, I don't think I know that one. Maybe I'll get to learn something today. Can anyone think of any others?
There's VH and VW.
Yeah, that's
VH. Can anyone think of any others?
Isn't
Right.
there just EM? Isn't that one as well?
There is. Okay, so this is actually literally all the responsive units I'm going to talk about in today's lecture, except also vmin and vmax. So seems like we have decent background in this, or at least we've heard some of these terms before. So this is going to be completely foreign to you all. So that's great. So we'll start out with the most basic one, most common one you've probably heard of before, percent. So percent is basic because we've all dealt with percentages before, but it's honestly not the simplest one because for a couple of reasons. For one thing, a percent is relative to its parent element. So since it's relative to some other element, that means that if you are sizing some element in percents and then you move it around your HTML, like you have a button on the right side of the screen and your boss comes in, he's like, actually the button should be on the left side of the screen. If you're sizing in percents, then the size of that item will change when you move it somewhere else on the screen. Sometimes that's exactly what you want, in which case then by all means use percents for sizing that item if your intention is that it should be different sizes based on its container. But sometimes if you want a dynamically sized element, having it be dynamically sized based on the parent is a little bit too finicky. You want something that you can move around the screen and that you can move around your HTML as you're developing, as you're considering different designs, that's not going to change its size constantly based on its parent. All right, so gives you kind of an extra thing to think about when you size things in percents, because you have to keep in mind, like, what is the parent element? How big is the parent? And then, what's X percent of Y? So figure out how big this guy is going to be. Another complication in using percents in CSS is that percent actually doesn't always refer to the parent. So for height and width, it does, but for some other CSS properties, this is not going to be the case. So transform is a CSS property, which you probably don't need, but it can be useful for doing sorts of like artistic things to elements. If you want to rotate something 12 degrees, or especially like rotate it into the Z-axis so it has a 3D effect. There's a lot of like fun, wacky things you can do with transform, including just move an element 10 pixels to the left. You can also do that with transform. But if you try to position an element with transform using percents, that percent will refer to the element itself instead of the element's parents, just because that's how percent works with transform. So my point isn't that you need to memorize like what percent refers to in every case. Just I want you to be aware that it's not always what you think it is. So if you're trying to size something with percentages, you're not doing height or width, you're setting some other property as a percentage of something. It might be good to double check what that percentage is actually a percentage of. Okay, so yeah, why don't we do just a real quick demo? Some percentages. So I'm gonna just make a simple 2-column layout here. Let me think here. Okay, so there's our left column. There's our right column. Just want to have enough text that actually fills up, looks like a column. Then I'm going to add some CSS to style this. First, we'll have to link it in. The relation is style sheet. Hyperlink reference is /main.css. Oh yeah, I didn't actually add any styles to my column class. So right now they're just block level elements. So they're just going to stack on top of each other like that. So in my main CSS, we will style the column class. It's a class, so we use the dot to target it. So first of all, just to get them to sit next to each other, not take up the full width of the page, I'm going to set display inline block, and then width set to 40%. So now you can see that the columns sit next to each other side by side. Each one taking up 40% of the width of the body, which is their container. If I put them into a smaller container, they would just take up each 40% of the width of that container. All right. So now we've got a container, which is just 80% of the page. And then inside of it, we have two columns, which are each 40% of the container. So that makes our individual columns here even smaller. So I guess this is another tricky bit about percentages. If you have nested items that are all measured in percentages, then you're going to have percentages of percentages. And at some point that becomes a little bit harder to reason about. So it's definitely a useful tool in your toolbox, but I honestly don't use them super commonly. So what I think is a little bit more useful are VHs and VWs. So for those who don't know, one VH is always equal to 1% of the height of the browser window. It doesn't matter like where in your HTML it is. If it's deep in some nested element or it's at the top level right inside the body, one VH is always 1% of the height of the window. And then similarly, one VW is always 1% of the width of the window. So these can be useful for things like, let's say you want to have a paywall or a login modal that you want to cover most of the user's screen, regardless of the user's dimensions. You can do that using VHs and VWs. So for example, let's see what a paywall might look like. So we give them a message telling them that they're trying to access content for free, but they need to sign up for it first. So I want this to cover the whole screen, can't scroll away from it. So we'll give it position fixed. And then since I want to cover most of the user's screen, we're going to set height as 90 VH and width is 90 VW. So the height is 90% of the height of the window. The width of this paywall is 90% of the width of the window. Um, Position fixed doesn't seem to be working for some reason. What's going on here? Anyways, so I'm just going to explicitly set top 0, left 0. I thought that was the default. Wait, why did this just revert? Seems like I've got some kind of CSS bug. I don't really want to take the time to debug it right now in front of you, but the point that I'm making is that this little gray background here should respond to the size of my window. As I'm getting smaller, it gets smaller horizontally. As the browser gets bigger vertically, it'll expand as well in that direction. Ideally, I should also be positioning it so it's in the middle of the screen, not just kind of up on this edge. But for the purposes of this demo, this demonstrates that I can make this pop up that covers other content and fills stretches to fill my screen. So yeah, VHs, VWs are pretty commonly useful. So related to these are vmin, which is 1% of the height or width, whichever is smaller. And then vmax is just the opposite. It's 1% of the height or width, whichever one is larger. So these are useful because these properties can be used to respond to the user's device orientation. So maybe you have a layout that looks good in landscape mode, but not in portrait mode. So this way you can size things up, not based on the height or the width specifically, but based on whichever is the longer or the shorter edge of the user's phone. Jesse?
Would this be useful when people have it in landscape mode versus portrait mode?
Yeah, I think so. Let me give you a quick example of that, quick demo that shows how these can be useful maybe. So let's say I'm trying to make a circle. So it needs to have like the same height and the same width. And I want it to expand to be proportional to the size of the window, but I want to make sure it always fits entirely in the window. So let's say a div. This is going to be our circle. Orange background. Give it enough border radius. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, great. So we've got an orange circle. Like I just said, my goal right now in this brief demo is I want this to expand proportionally to the screen size, but never actually clip off the screen. The whole circle should be visible at all times. So let's say I want to set, so instead of these fixed pixel heights and widths, I would set height 40 VH and a width of 40 VH. Let's make this a little bigger, actually. Okay, so now the circle is proportional to the height of my browser. And if I've got, a wide and short browser window, this works fine. Even at slightly different widths, at this point, it's not affecting the size of the circle. But if I had a very narrow and tall device, like more of a typical phone shape, as this gets taller here, at some point, the circle gets too big and it clips outside of the window, which I just said is what I want to not happen. And of course, if I size this in VW instead of VH, we just have the opposite problem, where on small screens, it'll fit for a variety of heights. But for very wide screens, it's not going to work for shorter screens. It needs to be taller to fit the whole circle in. So one way I can get around this is by using vmin instead. So it'll use either VH or VW, depending on which one is smaller. So this way, it's still proportional to my screen size, but there's no dimensions for my screen that I can set that'll cause it to clip outside of the window. So this is pretty responsive if that's what you need to do. All right, so the next responsive unit I want to cover are Ms and Rems, but I think this is probably a good time for questions and a break before we dive into those. Does anybody have any questions about percents or VH, VWs, anything we've covered so far? No questions? This all makes sense to everybody? That's great. So let's take a break. It's 10:17 now. Come back at 10:30 and we'll talk about Ms and Rems. Hello, folks. Welcome back. So now we're going to be learning about some new responsive units, Ms and Rems, that are especially useful for sizing fonts. Here we go. All right, so M and Rem both used mostly for sizing fonts. You can use them to size honestly anything that has a size in CSS, but most commonly fonts, and you'll see why. So M is probably the most basic one. I think it was the first one that existed in CSS. And M lets you size an element as a proportion of its parent's font size. So let's get an example of that up real quick. Say, so the container itself is going to have a fixed font size in pixels. But then the div inside of it, the class bigger, it's going to have a font size of 2M. So does anyone want to make a prediction? How big is this text going to be inside of the bigger class div?
24.
Yeah. So just like I was saying, the M lets you size something as a proportion of its parent. So 2Ms is 2 times 12 pixels. So I'm expecting this is going to be 24 pixels large. See if that actually happens. So here's my big text. It looks like it's bigger than 12 pixels, but let's double check. When I inspect it in the Elements tab on the right, the little Styles subtab shows me exactly what I set in my CSS file. You know, from main.css line 11, I set the bigger class, which gives it font size 2M. If I want to know like how big that actually is in fixed units, you can go to the Computed tab. And here it shows me font size is 24 pixels. So after all the CSS math is done, what's the actual font size at the end of the day? That's what you can get from the Computed tab. So one thing, there's a couple things that make M's tricky to work with. For one thing, just like with percentages, you know, it's relative to the parent. So if you're moving a paragraph around to different parts of your page, that paragraph is going to be bigger or smaller text, depending on the parent that you move it into. So it becomes a little bit more dynamic, more finicky than maybe you want. You want the text to respond somehow, but it shouldn't be changing that much just based on its parent. It also means that if you put nested elements inside of each other that are all sized with M's, that the M's compound each other. So let's get an example of that, show you just kind of another reason why M's are a little bit hard to work with. All right, so let's make some predictions here. How big are we expecting this text to render at, this last inner nested paragraph?
$96.
Why do you say that?
2 to the third power times 12, something like that.
Something like that. So it is quite large. You'll see that each of them is larger than the next, even though I only set font size here once as 2Ms. You know, I haven't set anything larger than 2 or 12 anywhere. But because it's always relative to the parent, this div class equals bigger has a font size of 24 pixels. So the one inside of it, is also sized as 2ems. It's going to be twice its parent, so it's 48 pixels. This guy is also sized as 2ems, so his parent is going to be 96 pixels. So yeah, it's 12 times 2 times 2 times 2. I think I got the right number of times 2s. But yeah, so you have the right idea, because we're nesting these m measurements inside of each other. They keep compounding off of each other. And it makes it just kind of hard to reason about the sizes of the fonts in your page when you use ems a lot, especially when you put them inside of each other. So I think it's good that you know how these work. I would honestly like to discourage you from ever using them. What I think is preferable is rem. So a rem is basically a root m. That's what the R is for in the front. And so instead of sizing elements relative to their parents, this lets you size an element relative to the font size on the HTML element. So I'm going to change this measurement to be to rem instead of 2ems. And then we're going to set font size on the HTML. And again, because the HTML element contains all other elements, every other element will inherit this font style unless we explicitly overwrite it. So let's say 14 pixels. No, we're going to do 11 pixels for the font size. Okay, so now all these bigger divs, they're not going to be relative to their parent. And so it doesn't matter how many of them we have nested inside of each other. This 2 rems is just 2 times 11, whatever we set as the font size for the HTML element. So now I'm still able to set things relatively. These paragraphs here are 22 pixels in font size because it's twice the size of the, where is it, 11 pixel font size that I set on the HTML element. There we go, that's what I'm looking for. So yeah, HTML from the main CSS has 11 pixel font size. So this is generally an easier way to set a whole bunch of font sizes across your entire application. So like, for example, let's say, the designer walks in, he says, all these fonts are too small. You need to make all the fonts here just like 10% bigger. Instead of going through my entire website and modifying every single font that I use in all the headers and paragraphs or whatever, modifying them to be just 10% bigger, I just changed this in one place. So this is very dry CSS. I'm not repeating myself. Change that one from 11 to 12. And now all the other fonts that are based on that use rems get an increase in size as well. Jesse, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, regarding the header, since you changed the HTML piece that kind of overarches everything, is it because it's H1? And that's why it's making that size as the header at that size versus, and the paragraph?
It's because font related properties get inherited from parent to child. So aside from anything to do with rems, just because I've set font size on the HTML element and this H1 is inside of it, that H1 is going to inherit that font size. So let's actually set an explicit size on the H1. I think here. So that's going to be for rem, I guess. Okay, so now the header is always twice as big as this bigger text, because I'm not letting it just inherit whatever font size it gets from the HTML element. I'm also sizing it with rems. So if we decide that the whole website is too small, you need to increase it by 33%, bump it from 12 to 16%, and now everything that was sized with rems gets bigger. Well, but just for demonstration, I'm going to have a fixed size for this paragraph. What's going on here? Something is cascading. I'm not expecting.
How big is this text is in the paragraph tag? Is that overriding that bigger text? The third paragraph tags. Did you explicitly stated that the font size is 12 pixels?
Yeah, but these bigger guys.
Yeah.
Oh wait, yeah, that's right. So yeah, you're right, because all the text is also inside of paragraphs here. This style was applying to more elements than I wanted it to. I only wanted it to apply to this paragraph here. So I'm going to make a more specific CSS selector, just selecting that paragraph. Okay, so now this paragraph here has a fixed text size. It's just going to be 12 pixels, but the other ones are all sized relative to the HTML element. So if I change the font size on HTML, everything that's sized in rems, so the header and the big text, that gets bigger. The small paragraph text, which was not sized with rems, that stays the same size because it's not responsive, it's not relative. So this is useful, like just for refactoring. You can change your font size in one place, changes it everywhere. This is very useful if you want to have user adjustable font. Like if you're making a newsreader app, you can just write a little bit of JavaScript that lets the user adjust the font size on the HTML element. And then you know that your CSS is going to make that affect all the other text on your page so that the user can easily scale all the text at once. You can also use it in media queries, as we'll see later. If you need to change the text on your entire website for smaller devices, you can do that easily in a media query by just changing the size of the HTML font instead of the fonts for all the elements throughout your website. That's going to be later on in today's lecture. We're going to cover media queries. But first, does anyone have any questions about Ms and Rems before we move on and talk about Flexbox a little bit?
I've got a quick question, Raphael.
Yep.
For Ms and Rems, can you use fractional measurements?
I don't see why not. Actually, this is going to be 2 rem. And then this guy is going to be 0.5 rem. Font size is 40. So yeah, this guy has a font size of 20 pixels. Even though the HTML has a 40 pixel font size because he's half a rem. So you can definitely use fractional rems. Any other questions? Alrighty, let's talk about Flexbox. So Flexbox is a relatively new CSS property. This was not available when I started writing CSS, and I'm very glad that we have access to it now. So Flexbox, or I should say, so Flexbox is a handful of related styles and CSS properties. So for starters, we can set a new display type, which is flex. So we learned the other day about the more basic display types being block, inline, and inline block. So those are kind of the classic display types that we've had forever. So more recently, we've had the option of display flex, which establishes some div or other container as a flex box. So this will change the way that elements flow in that container. It changes the document flow generally and gives you more options for how you can center or align content. Flex containers can also have other properties that you can add to them. And then you can even add special properties to the individual items inside of the Flex container if you want to have like one item that kind of doesn't flow the same way as its siblings, that stands out artistically. So to show you an example of Flexbox, to be honest, like I've used this maybe a dozen or so times throughout my career for solving a variety of styling problems, but I don't use it like every day to the point where I memorize all the different properties. So no joke, every time I need to use Flexbox, I'm going to Google CSS Flexbox, and you find this really great article from CSS Tricks. I'm not just like trying to evangelize this blog. It's really just a coincidence that he's got all these great resources for things that I'm trying to teach you. So this same article about Flexbox, I've referred back to it a whole bunch of times. It has a bunch of really great diagrams also to explain what Flexbox does. So generally speaking, Flexbox is for one-dimensional layout problems. So if you have a row of elements or a column of elements and you're trying to center them in some particular way, Flexbox might have the solution for you. So this is showing just how you start out. You have some container. This is probably just a div. You set display flex, which basically just establishes it as a flex container and says that the items inside of it do not follow the normal document flow, but they are flex items. Normally in the document flow, items go from left to right. If you don't want that to happen, you can set flex direction on the container and they'll flow right to left or bottom to top. Flex wrap also changes the document flow. I showed you normally items wrap when they fill up the top row on the right side, they go back to the left on the next row. But you can change that. You can have items not wrap, they just go all the way off the side. You can have them wrap in the reverse direction so that after we fill up this top row, the second row starts filling from the right. So it kind of snakes back and forth instead of just always starting from the left. If that's just how you think the document flow should work, you can set it that way with Flexbox. But my favorite one by far, I would say, is justify content. Like most of the time when I have a problem that can be solved with Flexbox, the solution is using justify content. I want one of these kinds of layouts. Either, I've centered a whole bunch of items just in the middle of a row with some padding between them, or I've spaced them out kind of naturally looking. So without using Flexbox, this kind of spacing where there's like a fixed amount of space in between the elements, then also some on the edges, this is kind of hard to do and really finicky. You'd have to write a lot of CSS to make it good and make it dynamic. But Flexbox provides a really simple solution for these kinds of problems immediately. So I'm going to demonstrate justify content real quick because it's my favorite, it's most useful, and it's pretty easy to show. Okay, so I've got my Flex container. Just has display Flex. And then inside, I'm going to put a few items. These are just going to be, squares or circles that I want to center. Let me think. So let's get a few more of these. That's too many. Okay. So we got a bunch of circles. By default, just putting these plain circular divs inside of my Flex container doesn't do anything particularly interesting. I'm going to have to set some more Flex properties on the container. So like I was saying, justify content is the Flex property that I'm interested in here. These are the different values it can have. Space between, space around, space evenly, center are the ones that I use most often, I'd say. So something kind of like this. So display Flex, justify content. Let's look at space around. Okay, so immediately with just that one declaration, well, two, display Flex and then justify content space around, I get this really, I think this is pretty elegant spacing for these items here. So I'm just going to play around in my inspector here and see what are some other values for justify content we can do. So I'm just going to go to the inspector in the styles tab, just click on space around. I'm just going to delete that, and then it auto completes with all the different options for it. So I'm actually going to use the arrow keys here and just scroll through them just one at a time. And so this is going to show me a little preview of what it would look like. A lot of these values aren't very interesting looking. Here, space around, very similar to space between, just leaves space between doesn't leave as much space on the edges. And there's space evenly, which is similar to space around, except the difference is in the edges. Space around leaves half as much space on the edges before the first one, after the last one, as it does in between the ones in the middle. Whereas with space evenly, you have the same amount of space between the edges and the first one, and between the last one and the right edge, and between all the ones in the middle. So very slightly different use case for spacing things out. They look kind of similar. I think space around usually looks nicer. But either way, the fact that you can do this with just like 1 or 2 lines of CSS instead of writing a lot more basic CSS using inline block elements is really a lifesaver. Excuse me.
Hey Raphael, can you show me the circle class in your CSS?
Yeah. So they're orange.
Okay, thank you.
Height and width, got a border radius, nothing too fancy. So yeah, that's most commonly what I use Flexbox for. It does have some other things that it can do. All right, so align items by default in the regular document flow, elements will be at the top of their row, kind of like how Flex Start works. But if you have a whole bunch of items of different heights, you might want to have them lined up like centered like this along your vertical axis. And again, this kind of align items baseline, this is really hard to do with plain vanilla CSS without using Flexbox. I could probably figure it out, but it would be a super ugly hack. And I'm just really appreciative that I can achieve this visual design using just, a couple lines of CSS, just align items baseline. So I also mentioned that you can make exceptions for the individual items in your Flex container. So I've just been setting properties on the container itself, but you could set properties on the Flex items. So like Flex Grow is one example. If you have a whole row of elements like a nav bar or whatever, and you want them to be dynamic and expand with the screen size, but you want one of them to be bigger than the others, Flex Grow lets you do that. So in this example, it's showing that we've got 3 items, 1, 2, and 1, and they should all be dynamic and expand as the screen expands. But item number 2 should always be twice as big as the item number is 1. So that's Flex Grow. See if I can get that working here. .grow. Flex Grow 2. And then we'll say this one circle is going to be a growing circle. It's going to be bigger than the others. Oh, did not save my CSS file. Let's try this again. Okay, that is not what I expected to look like, but I guess it is working. This is considerably bigger than I thought it would be. Do I have to set flex around these guys? So maybe because one of them had a flex grow set and the others didn't, I got some strange behavior. So I'm going to set it for all the circles. So they're all going to have flex grow of 1. But this one is going to have flex grow of 2. So I'm not exactly sure why they're not circles anymore. I might have to read into Flexbox a little bit more. But at least you can see that the grow property is working as advertised. This one div with the grow class on it is twice as big as the other ones. Now, as I resize my browser, they all expand to take up the extra space. But the one that I gave the grow class to is still going to try to be twice as big as the others. Sometimes it won't be able to do that. If I set like a fixed width for the container, it's possible that this item just isn't able to grow twice as big as the others. It just doesn't have enough space. But when there is extra space, it'll be twice the size as its neighbors. So yeah, if you find yourself needing to put together some kind of artistic design that works well on mobile devices, looks like that with one item that grows relative to the others, maybe flex grow is what you're looking for. There's a few other properties here. I've not used them and I'm not sure what I would use them for. Jake?
Yeah, what in your code tells to single out that one particular circle? It's called circle grow as the class, right?
So
and
this selector here is targeting 2 classes. This applies to elements that have both the circle class and the grow class.
Oh, so class in your on line 37 and your index. So circle space grow, that's not one class called circle grow. It's 2 classes then divided by a space, right?
Correct.
Oh,
Class
okay.
names in CSS cannot have spaces in them because space is how you separate multiple classes in the class attribute.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Why don't I just write that down? I think it's good to say out loud. Okay. Any other questions about Flexbox? No more.
I have
Flex-
a quick question.
Yep.
Was Flexbox just recently was added to CSS3 or something? 'Cause I remember you used to have to use it like Bootstrap, like you had to import it into your project. It was like a couple years ago, though, like maybe 3-4 years ago. But did it just become standard with CSS3, like where it's already in?
I want to say CSS3. I don't remember exactly when it became standardized, but it is fairly recent. So CSS3 sounds like a good estimate. Like CSS3 was introduced right when I started coding. So I'm not exactly sure like what is CSS3 and what is CSS2 because it was all just CSS to me at that point. But yeah, Flexbox is relatively new. And if you're wondering why so many other CSS techniques are so ugly, it's because we didn't have Flexbox at the time when those were designed.
Gotcha. And I only asked that just to ask, like, if someone has like an older browser, will it give them issues? Like seeing something that you designed in Flexbox?
Probably, yeah.
Gotcha.
So there are ways you can handle that, I guess. Let me think how to put this. So we're going to get to Bootstrap later in this lecture. And so Bootstrap is written with Flexbox internally, but I believe that it's like smarter than just using Flexbox in all of its classes, but I think it has some fallbacks. So if you try to use Bootstrap to style your website and someone visits your website with a browser that doesn't support Flexbox, I believe that Bootstrap like is able to replace those Flexbox styles with some alternate styles, which are maybe like less performant, less efficient, less pretty, but will work well enough on a browser that doesn't support Flexbox. So there are a lot of situations like that where you have to have fallbacks. Like you'll try multiple techniques to do one thing because you're kind of expecting that the user might not support your first try. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Did we have another hand up?
Yes, Rafa, thank you. Just have a quick question. This might be really basic. It's about the CSS when you trying to make a circle, you use the border radius. I've seen like this way you use pixels or percentage. Like what's the main differences like when you use those units like make a circle?
So the thing with border radius is that like there's a maximum radius at some point. It's as round as it can be, and increasing it beyond that doesn't do anything. So if you just want it to be perfectly rounded, you can just put in a big number. So honestly, like I never really think too hard about border radius in CSS. I'm just going to show you real quick, like how I style things with border radius. Let me just take all this flex grow stuff off. So let's say I want to have rounded corners on these squares. They're not as round as I'd like. I'm going to inspect it. Look at the border radius. It's 9. I don't know what this should be, but it's too pointy. So I'm just going to kind of scroll up here. And then I can see it change live in front of me and just basically stop when I like how it looks. Maybe I think 18 is how round these corners should be. But 24 is too much. So I'll just stop there. So I just kind of fiddle with it with the inspector, decide when it looks good, and then paste that value into my editor and save it. I've never done math to calculate a border radius.
So the units, like a pixel or percentage, they don't really matter that much. Is that what it is?
I mean, you can make a circle with both pixels or percentages. I'm sure they're different. If I set this to 10%, that's kind of pointy. If I set this to 10 pixels, is that any different? Let's say 40%. Yeah, so there's a difference rounding the corners with pixels versus percentages. I guess if you have a whole bunch of items of different sizes and you want to have a consistent roundness amongst them, maybe it would make more sense to round things in percentages. But I've never really thought that hard about rounded corners in anything I've built. Mhm. Okay, any other questions? All right, let's move on. John?
Hey, Raphael. I put the same exact like terminology you put into my LinkedIn just to try to get the Flexbox to work with the circles. And whenever I refresh the page, whatever, and I hover over it, it has a width of 0. I just didn't know what's going on.
That sounds unusual. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but do you want to share your screen for like 2 minutes?
Sure.
If we can't figure it out in 2 minutes, we'll have to continue with the lecture. Maybe take it offline. Can do some
No
debugging
problem.
in a breakout room, but maybe we'll figure it out fast. I just have to pause sharing.
It still says you're sharing the screen.
How about now?
That should be good. I should be able to as well. All right, there we go. All right. Are you able to see?
Yep.
Okay. Actually, I don't know if you'll be able to see. Can you see my code?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So I put it in the same way you did, just had a class called Flex Container and then a class called Circle.
Mhm.
And then the same exact way over here with the vmin for the width and the height of the circle as well.
Yep.
But when I run it over here, there should be the black dots should be underneath my name, but they're not popping up.
It should. So let's debug this a little bit. So you have an HTML element with a class which has some styles. So let's look in the inspector in your browser, find the HTML element that's not doing what you think. So it's that div, great. You want to put a CSS class on it. So it looks like it has flex container. Is that spelled the way you think it should be spelled? I think it looks correct also. So then let's click on that and make sure that this class is actually applying the styles that you think it should. So click on that, and then you go down to the styles section below, and I see nothing. So there seems to be some discrepancy between what you think is in your CSS file and what your browser thinks is in your CSS file. So yeah, it's in the same folder. Let's go back to your browser real quick. Can you go to the network tab? Yeah, right there. So this shows when you download things as part of loading the page. Because first we download the HTML document and then that sends a request for the CSS file. Can you refresh your page real quick? Okay, so we saw all these files download, including that image. Can you click on index.css? So this is the file your browser is downloading. It looks like the one you wrote. Can you scroll down to where the flex class is? Okay, so that's interesting. So we don't see the Flexbox class here, right?
Yeah, it's not there at all.
Yeah. So for some reason, the CSS file that your browser has downloaded is not the one that you think you're writing. Does this look like it used to be your CSS file? Like maybe you just have unsaved changes or something?
It could be. I should have autosave on my VS Code though.
Right. I see the file is saved. I just meant something like that. Like you're looking at an outdated version of the correct file, not just like the entirely wrong file.
That could be. I did just recently add these last two elements like recently.
Okay, so let's try something else. Go back to your browser. Go to, so open the little gear menu in the top right. Yes, that one. I know there's a bunch of gear menus. Sorry, can you like change the orientation of your dev tools or like pop it out? It's just too small and I don't think I can see the
Oh.
UI I'm looking for. Wait, so this is inside the gear menu. Can you click the disable cache button? You see right
Where
below
is
where you're
that?
at?
Oh,
Right below your mouse. So now refresh the page.
oh, there it goes.
Okay, so this is a really common, I don't want to call it bug, but frustration that many of you will run into when writing CSS, is that browsers will cache a lot of the files that they download. That means just like save a copy of it. So it's to be more efficient so that if you load the same website again in the future, your browser can say, oh, I've already got this CSS file. I don't need to download the same file again. That's just like wasting bits over the internet. So I'm just gonna, load faster by using the saved copy of the CSS file that I've got. And for the most part, that works really great. It makes the web a faster place. But it's kind of frustrating when we're developing CSS because you might change one thing in your CSS file and then load it back up again in your browser. And your browser thinks that it's the same CSS file. And so it uses the copy from its cache instead of actually just reading fresh the actual file that you're editing. So one setting that I honestly recommend all of us have set in our dev tools is that disable cache button. So I usually have my dev tools set up a little bit differently. So I'm a little bit thrown off by your layout. Usually the button is labeled disable cache while dev tools is open, because you wouldn't want to just like globally disable cache all the time because it's pretty important for regular web browsing. And you wouldn't want to forget to disable it. So what that button actually does is it only disables the cache while dev tools is open. It assumes you're developing a website at that point. So yeah, if you don't have that checked, you're probably going to get a lot of frustrating experiences like this, where your code doesn't update, the latest version of your file doesn't appear in your browser.
Is there a way I can set it to be disable cache when dev tools are active, the way you have it?
I'm pretty sure that's what your button is doing. I think it's just there's not enough space in the UI for it to put the extra parentheses. Let me think. Can you click the 3 dots in the top right, the vertical dots? Right, yeah, those guys. And then dock on the bottom. So the third icon, yeah, that one. Sorry, can you close the little like X on the right side for the what's new below it?
I'm sorry,
Right
the
below where
right
you
here?
just were. Yeah, that guy.
Oh,
Okay. And then can you expand that window? Can you click on the gear again? Are we still in that menu? I'm not sure. Your interface looks a little bit different from mine. Maybe I've got something set up weird. But either way, you did find the right button. You did disable your cache. Looks like your website's working properly now.
okay, thank you.
Yep. So that only took.
Page 2, right? And that'll clear the cache.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
I was saying you could do a hard refresh on the page as well, and I think that clears the cache and might solve that problem too.
Yeah, that's another way that you can get around that. I think, here, let me just share my screen again. So on Mac, I think that is like Shift Command R or something. Okay, so yeah, in the view menu, you can see normally reload this page is Command R. If I hold Shift while I have this menu open, it tells me this different hint that Shift Command R is force reload. I don't know why that's not like in the list already, just as another item under reload. Mac OS always tries to hide useful options from you for some reason. But yeah, so if you're on Mac, Shift Command R will force reload the page, which should ignore your cache and download fresh assets from the server. So that's another way you can get around this if you don't think you're getting the latest copy of your files from your server. All right, so moving on. Probably the most powerful tool that you have for designing responsive websites are media queries. So media queries, I consider these to be kind of like the big guns of responsive design. They take a little bit more effort to get set up, but you can do basically anything with them. You can solve any responsive design problem. If the layout just doesn't work at exactly 556 pixels wide and it's perfect at every other width, you can set a media query that sets specific styles for just that size. So I guess a simple way to describe what they actually do, how you use them. See, media queries are like if statements for your CSS. They let you check certain conditions about the user's browser, their machine, and then apply completely different styles if that condition is true. So I'm going to return to that font size example from before. So we got the HTML element here is 40 pixels. But let's say for really small screens, I want that to be a smaller number, just so I can fit more text in on the screen, and because you're probably holding the phone really close to your face. So that makes sense. So what I'm going to do is at the end of my CSS file, or in a CSS file after all my CSS files, the point is I want my media queries to load last. I'm going to write something like this. So to write a media query, use the keyword @media, and then the parentheses, you say the conditions that you're querying. And then inside of these curly braces, you just write more CSS, just any CSS styles that you want to apply, only when this is true. So for browsers that are at most 1245 pixels wide, the HTML element will have a font size of 18 pixels. So now I'm going to add another one to override this for a slightly different size. So the order matters here. So note that if a screen is, let's say, 1,000 pixels wide, this media query is going to match because it's less than 1245. This media query is not going to match because it's more than 845. So there's no confusion there. We're just going to apply font size 18 pixels. But if the browser is, let's say, 600 pixels wide, then technically both of these styles would apply because it's less than 1245 pixels and it's also less than 845 pixels. But in that case, only this media query would apply just because it's written afterwards. So I'm specifically writing my media queries in an order such that if multiple of them are true simultaneously, only the bottom will take effect. That's what I want to happen here. So let's actually see what that looks like. Again, I have breakpoints at 12:45 and 8:45. Okay, so currently my browser is 14 pixels, 1400 pixels wide. So none of my media queries are applying. I get below 12:45. So there we hit a breakpoint. Y'all see that happen? This isn't like a fluid, gradual kind of responsive design like the responsive units I've been using before. This is just an if statement. If this is true, do something completely different. So between 1246 pixels, 1245, we're setting the font size. And we get even smaller at 845. We hit another breakpoint where we change the font size on the HTML element from 18 down to 14, because I think that's more appropriate for a smaller screen. So generally speaking, when I'm building a website, I'll be dragging the browser window in and out just to make sure that it looks good at every specific screen size. Sometimes you'll find like a range where like a wide range of screen sizes where you can make it look good by using like Flexbox or relative units. Some other responsive technique that I've showed you today. But sometimes you'll get a situation where you've got a layout that works for big screens. You've got another layout that works for small screens, but there's just like 10 pixels in the middle where if a device is this specific width, it just totally breaks your layout and you have to do something different. So media queries are one way that you can take control of the rendering like that. You can specify for exactly any screen width how the screen should look or how all of your styles should be. Let's see. So there's a few other things you can query aside from screen width. So I've got this great MDN article, tells you a little bit about it. So you can query for orientation. So have different styles that apply in portrait versus landscape mode. I guess you can query the user's resolution. So, maybe you have lower quality images for a low resolution display. Some of you dark theme enthusiasts might like the prefers color scheme media query. Some modern operating systems, you can set like dark theme or light theme, like right in Windows or right in Mac OS. And I think there are some other tools that let you set a color scheme in your browser. But basically, if a user has set that they prefer dark mode, you can query that with this media query. And if true, user prefers dark mode, you can apply a totally different set of styles that have a different color scheme, so it's easier to read at night. So honestly, I don't use most of these different media query features. Like here, you can write media queries that target printers. Like if you're printing out a map, if anyone can remember MapQuest from the days before Google Maps, you probably only want to see like the streets and the geography and stuff. You don't need to see the website's nav bar because you can't click on it on a piece of paper. So you could write a media query that for printers hides the nav bar and sidebars and anything that wouldn't make sense to print. But yeah, so for the most part, the only media queries I write are at media max width, some specific number of pixels. All right, so that's really all I've got to say about media queries. You can do anything with them. They're really flexible, really powerful. Any questions about media queries before we talk about Bootstrap and CSS frameworks more generally? All right. Moving on. So some of you all might have heard of Twitter Bootstrap before. Twitter Bootstrap is a CSS framework that is built by engineers at Twitter. It's essentially just a collection of CSS files, collection of style sheets that someone else has written that we can apply in our own code. So it's pretty similar to like JavaScript or Python libraries where someone else writes a whole bunch of code and we don't have to understand it fully. We just have to understand how to use it, how to work with it, what to put into it, what to get out of it. And then we can sort of stand on the shoulders of giants to build our website faster. So a CSS framework is a similar idea. Some very smart designers over at Twitter have written a lot of really clever CSS that we might not need to understand fully, but you at least need to understand how to use it so you can develop your layouts much faster, more efficiently using Bootstrap. So there's a handful of reasons why you might want to use a CSS framework. So one benefit, just automatically out of the box of using a CSS framework, they give you what's known as normalization. So across different browsers, there are lots of different default styles. So like I showed you, Chrome for Mac, there's an 8 pixels default margin on the body element. Headers have a lot of default margin on them. These are all just default styles that the browser applies, but different web browsers might apply different default styles. So what that means then is you can't rely on the default styling unless you just can't rely on the default style of HTML elements because it's going to be different in different browsers. If you actually want to have a consistent look and feel for your website, you need to explicitly set styles for every single CSS style. So that's one of the things that Bootstrap does, is it explicitly sets rules for basically every CSS style for every element so that nothing is undefined, nothing is left to the defaults, that it's going to look the same on every browser as much as possible. So the main feature of Bootstrap, what I'm going to spend the most time showing you right now, is Bootstrap helps you build a responsive grid. So it's a grid, it'll help you build rows and columns without having to write a lot of CSS yourself to keep those arranged orderly. So that's really useful. And it's also responsive, meaning that Bootstrap has a whole bunch of media queries already included in it. In a lot of the CSS styles that I said are written in those style sheets, a lot of that is just media queries, how to render different classes at different screen sizes. So just using Bootstrap kind of automatically gives you a lot of responsiveness in your website. And then there are just some small steps you can take to make it much more responsive even. Because it's got those media queries built in. And also, this is maybe a little bit less essential, but a nice to have. Bootstrap has some built-in JavaScript components. So some really fancy widgets that you might have seen on other websites like carousels or accordions or whatever, you don't have to build those by hand from scratch. You can basically just copy and paste a Bootstrap component and kind of figure out the inputs and outputs, make it work for your site. All right, so let's add some Bootstrap to this website here. So like I was saying, Bootstrap is mostly just a bunch of CSS styles. You can add it in with a link tag. But now I'm not going to actually download Bootstrap and put it locally here. I'm going to get Bootstrap from a CDN. Has anyone heard of a CDN before?
Content delivery network.
Yeah, can you tell me what that is?
Just basically replicating information to be served. It was part of the AWS full certification thing as well.
Yep. Yeah, if you got your AWS certification, you might have had to learn a little bit about CDNs and what those are for. So a CDN is a content delivery network. Which is basically not a single server, but a network of servers that are geographically spread around the world or around the country, whose goal is to allow users to download specific files as fast as possible. So like I could maybe download bootstrap.css directly from Twitter, but they've got, just one server wherever they're located. And they probably don't want people downloading it directly from them instead. So what they do is they upload it to a CDN, which is a network of servers all across America or all across the world, so that anyone who needs to use Bootstrap can contact the CDN and they automatically get it from whichever server is closest to their browser, wherever they're connecting from. So ideally, you should be able to have users from all over the world connecting to your site, and they'll still get a relatively quick experience regardless of where they're coming from. Because you use a CDN, they're always able to download it from a server that's local to them. So I'm just going to Google Bootstrap CDN. Oh, it looks like they have their own CDN actually. So commonly I use CDN.js, which is another content delivery network that has basically every JavaScript project you would ever want to use on the front end. But I guess Bootstrap, Twitter thinks they're cool, so they've got their own CDN just for Bootstrap. That's fine. I click through. So this is a link that I can just copy. See the actual HTML that I need. Cool, so here's my style sheet from cdn.js deliver, blah, blah, Bootstrap. The version number is in here, so I can change the URL to get a different version of Bootstrap if I wanted to. Now, I'm not even going to write any styles, just going to refresh the page after we've loaded Bootstrap in. Let's actually get some more stuff in here. Okay, so I refresh the page, and without writing any styles of my own, we can already see a few things have changed. So for one thing, there's no longer the 8-pixel border around the body, because Bootstrap standardizes that. There's no border on any web page in any browser unless I add it specifically. It also changes the fonts. Different browsers will use different default fonts. So if you don't specify exactly what font to use, different users in different browsers will see that differently. So Bootstrap standardizes that by setting a default font for every element. So if I want to understand, where all these styles come from, like why does my H1 look different now that I just loaded Bootstrap? So you can see here, these are, from Bootstrap. I guess Bootstrap is multiple smaller files that I downloaded, and this is one of them. You can see in the tooltip that popped up that this is from the Bootstrap Cdn. So that's where the style sheet is coming from. So these styles are coming from Bootstrap. So here's one example. Because my browser right now is less than 1200 pixels. Where'd that go? Oh, this is minimum width. I thought it was max width. So yeah, because my browser is greater than 1200 pixels, this media query is taking effect, applying to H1 elements, and it's giving it font size 2.5 rem. So this is using a lot of those responsive techniques that I told you about earlier today, media query, changing something to a different number of rems. But it's nice that all this complexity is hidden inside of the bootstrap.css. And so I just know I have to use it instead of knowing all the CSS that it's built with. So by far, the most important feature in Bootstrap is the grid system. So I'm going to make a quick grid in Bootstrap. So I'm going to start using a bunch of classes that Bootstrap has defined for me, including this container class. Note, I do not define that anywhere in my CSS file. Let's just comment that out. Okay, we commented that out. So I'm not defining a class called container now. This is coming from Bootstrap. It's just generally how you start making a grid. You have to put everything inside of your container. We'll just put another H1 in here. All right, so up at the top, we've got our regular H1, not in a container. It's right up against the left side of the screen. But then all the content that is inside of our container looks a little bit prettier. It gets these automatic margins and padding on the side. So it's not gonna, brush up against the edges of the screen. Should also have some media queries set at specific breakpoints. So the container changes sizes at certain specific breakpoints. But let's see how we can actually make a grid control this a little bit better. Inside of your container, in order to make a grid, we have to use rows. So again, I'm just going to put this on a div, use the class row. It's defined for me by Bootstrap. And now inside of this row, I have 12 columns, or another way you can put that is I can have any number of columns, but they have to have their widths add up to 12. So I'll show you that just now. So we can, in case it didn't quite make sense as I said it. Okay, so this is the most basic grid I could have created for you. We have our container. Inside of our container is a row. Inside of our row, we have 2 columns. Just by using the class COL, that creates a Bootstrap column. And without specifying anything further, each of my columns is going to take up an equal proportion of the row that it's in. So, each of these is half of the row. There's the row, container. So what's more useful though is when you specify widths for the rows. So let's say this column has more text in it, it's bigger text. I want this column to be wider. So we can set sizes on them. Col4, col-8. See, these are similar column classes. If you add a number after a dash, you can specify how wide the column is. Now, these aren't specific units like 8 inches or pixels or whatever. This is out of 12. So every row in Bootstrap has 12 columns in it. And you've got to make sure that these columns add up to 12 if you want to fill up the row. So that's what we've got here. This one is 4 columns wide. And this one is 8 columns wide. So out of 12, that's 1/3 and 2/3. I can expand my browser and it'll maintain that aspect ratio. Oops. Of course, I don't have to have them add up to 12, but that just means that there's going to be empty space. So now the 2 columns just don't fill up the row because I've set 1 to 4 and the other one is 6. So the second column is bigger, but it still doesn't fill up the row. Generally, you'd want to fill it up neatly. So yeah, let's actually fill this up properly. Or if we wanted, we could have like an even smaller sidebar over here. Cool, so we've got our 2-column sidebar, a 4-column column, and a 6-column other column. Question? Saw someone's hand go up. No? Okay. So,
sorry, Rafael, I was muted. Just a quick question. So when you're using those class names, like the column and row, since you didn't use them from the CSS file you created, is there like a dictionary or anywhere you find those class names from the Bootstrap you downloaded? Or
I would look through the documentation.
Okay, thank you.
So getbootstrap.com has, oh, this is for Bootstrap 4. But yeah, they have really great documentation in general, in my opinion. Not examples, docs, layout, grid. So yeah, under layout and then grid, it explains these row and column classes that I'm showing you. So definitely there's too much in Bootstrap for me to show you all of it today. So you should get comfortable with looking at the documentation. If you're thinking like, want to solve this problem, I'll bet Bootstrap has something that'll help me out, but I'm not sure. Other questions? I saw some hands.
Hi, Rafael. So I had a question about just grid in Bootstrap. It seems like grid in Bootstrap takes away a lot of like the main uses of like what Flexbox was used for originally in like rows and organization.
You're saying that the Bootstrap grid, you think, kind of removes the use, or like
for a lot of like the Flexbox things, like putting things in like horizontal rows or columns. Would you just recommend that we just like use grid most of the time over to Flexbox things?
So to be clear, you're talking about the Bootstrap Grid system here, not CSS Grid, right?
Yeah, I'm actually, I don't know what CSS Grid is. Are we using Bootstrap Grid right now or CSS Grid?
Right. This is Bootstrap's grid system. So this is something provided to us by the framework, does not exist naturally in CSS. There's also fairly recently a CSS technology called CSS Grid, which lets you do kind of similar things to how these column classes work, except using the actual CSS Grid is just much more involved and much more complicated. Like you have to do a lot more work in order to get the same kind of design. So I would definitely recommend you learn how to use the Bootstrap Grid or some other CSS frameworks grid system to rapidly build websites. So I don't think it replaces Flexbox either. I would say every time that I've used Flexbox professionally was in a website that was already using Bootstrap. So Bootstrap kind of solves like the bigger problems, and I feel like Flexbox is more for smaller things usually. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Did I see another hand up?
Yeah, so I had a question about like, so then if you wanted to implement your own CSS or whatever with Bootstrap, how would you do that exactly? Just link your style sheet as well and then
Yes. Critically though, you should put your own style sheet after Bootstrap's style sheet. Figure that Bootstrap is kind of setting like defaults, like a baseline for your app. And then you're going to probably want to override some of the Bootstrap styles. So it's important that your style sheet is included after the Bootstrap style sheet. So yeah, order matters here. Does that make sense?
yeah, thank you.
Okay, so where the column classes really shine is when we use responsive column classes. So we can have the different columns take up different amounts of space at different screen sizes. So let's look at, oh, I'm already on the right section. So in Bootstrap, there are 6 different screen sizes. We don't have to deal with like 1,000 different media queries for every single pixel width. There are only 6 different screen sizes we have to work with. Screens that are over 1,400 pixels are XXL. So let's see. How big is my screen here? So at full width, my laptop screen is 1640 pixels. So my laptop screen, as far as Bootstrap is concerned, is larger than XXL. And then XL greater than 1200, 992, 768, etc. So these 2-letter acronyms or 3-letter, this is how you can refer to different screen sizes in Bootstrap. So let's say this one, I only want it to take up 4 columns on small screens. But on medium screens, I want this to take up 8 columns. And then for this guy, on small screens, I want it to take up 8 columns. And on medium screens, I want it to take up 4 columns. Let's get that guy out of here for a second. Okay, so right now my screen size is, it's over 1,000. So this is larger than a medium-sized screen as far as Bootstrap is concerned. So we can see this first column is really wide, the second one is narrow. So that's what I would expect, because On medium screens, this first column is 8 columns wide. And on medium screens, the second div here is 4 columns wide. But on small screens, that should flip around, where the first one is going to become small and then the second one becomes larger. So I'm just going to make my browser smaller gradually till we hit that breakpoint. There we go. So under 768 pixels, I passed another Bootstrap breakpoint. So now this left column, because we're on a small screen, is 4 columns wide. And the one on the right is now 8 columns wide. So this is really one of the most powerful features of Bootstrap and the grid system in particular, is being able to change your column widths based on the screen size. Let's see, and most commonly also, this is just the default behavior if you don't specify otherwise. But on extra small screens, everything is going to take up 12 columns because I only specified for small, but I didn't specify extra small. So by default, it's like col XS12, essentially. So that means if my screen is as small as can be, all the elements will just stack up on top of each other, which is pretty typical for a mobile layout. Just have everything stacked on top of each other because there's no horizontal space. That's the only thing. I want to show you one other nifty use case for the Bootstrap Grid. So let's say I want to have like rows of images. And I want to have like 4 images per row. Okay, so I'm reusing the circle class from before. And I'm going to put a whole bunch of them in here. So this is valid in Bootstrap. I know that I told you you're only supposed to have 12 columns to a row, but these rows can wrap around. So these 4 elements, these are 12 columns because they're MD3 and there's 4 of them. So that's going to be 1 row. This is going to be 1 row. This is going to be 1 row, etc. Let's make these a little prettier. Hang on a second. I need to redo this markup here. Hang on a second. So the circle should be another element inside of the column. This is actually a common enough problem I've run into in the past. If you have a div that is more than just a column or more than just a row, sometimes that can get a little bit wonky. So I've got a pretty simple div. It's just holding my Bootstrap styles. And okay, there's one circle. Okay. That's working how I expected it to. So I've got a whole bunch of columns. Each are supposed to be 3 columns wide on a medium screen. They've got these circles inside of them just so you can see the columns. So there are 3 columns wide on a medium screen, so we can fit 4 into 12. So that looks like what we're doing here. Got 4 in the first row, 4 in the second row, and then there's only 3 left here, so that's how they fill out. But let's say that on smaller screens, 4 to a row is just too many. We want to do 3 to a row instead. So we can have different number of items appearing per row at different screen sizes. So on medium screens, it's going to be 3 columns wide. On small screens, it's going to be 4 columns wide. So then you can only fit 3 of them per row. Oh, right. And I need to have more than 1 circle. Okay, so on a medium screen, we've got 4 of these guys in a row. And as we cross the breakpoint, we go down to 3 of them in a row because they changed from column medium 3 to column small 4. So it takes a little bit of time, I think, to be able to intuit this and really understand how the Bootstrap Grid works and what you can do with it. But it is really flexible and really powerful. So I'd encourage you to play around with it. You can also put rows inside of rows. That's totally legit. Sometimes if you have a really complex layout, so I've got this row, it's got 2 columns in it. And then inside of this column, I can just put another div, classes row. And then this can have more divs inside of it with their own content or whatever. So note that in this nested row, the columns still add up to 12. The columns in Bootstrap are relative to their container row. They always add up to 12. So even though this column is 6 and then I have a row inside of it, you might think that the columns inside of that nested row need to add up to 6. Excuse me. But that's not how Bootstrap works. Every row, the columns should add up to 12 in order to fill that row. So yeah, Bootstrap has a lot of features, but by far the most useful one, that I rely on the most for all my projects, is just this grid system. And just if you know how to have different sizes at different breakpoints using these responsive column classes, if you know how to put rows inside of other rows, if you can do those 2 things, you can make a lot of really sophisticated designs that are, responsive and look good on a wide variety of devices. So if you're getting overwhelmed by all the things that Bootstrap has to offer, I would say focus on the grid system and understanding how this works. That being said, if you're not overwhelmed by Bootstrap and you want to see all of the fun bells and whistles it's got, it can be interesting to browse through the documentation and just see what they have available to you. So like I said, Bootstrap is mostly a CSS style sheet, but it also has some JavaScript included. So you can just use these kind of off-the-shelf components with relatively little effort. So I think it's a good one to start with. Most basic one is the collapse. I use this Bootstrap component in like all of my projects, basically. Basically, if you just want to have a piece of text or any element that is hidden underneath something else and is revealed when you click on it, this is one way you can do it. In this example, it's set up all with just HTML and CSS. You don't even have to write any JavaScript to make this work, just by making sure that like the href refers to the element with the right ID. Then the button refers to the right like collapsible section. But you can also use JavaScript to control this, to have these sections open and close without a user interaction, just programmatically with JavaScript. So it's not impossible to build something like this yourself. And I think some people saw the details HTML element that kind of does something similar in just raw HTML. But this is going to look a little bit better. I think you get these animations for free, some other features. So yeah, collapses are very useful for just any kind of standard website. More advanced version of the collapse is an accordion. You've probably seen these in like an FAQ. This is really just a bunch of collapses that are slapped together, but with some extra logic so that if you open one of them, it closes all the others. But you can disable that if you want to. So here's another version of the accordion where each section can stay open independently. So if you have to build an FAQ, I would probably just use one of these instead of building it on my own. Let's see, I know you've all seen one of these before. If you have a whole bunch of images you want to show the user, but just not enough space to show them all, you can use a carousel, which is basically a container that holds multiple images. And then you can either let the user scroll through it or set it to automatically scroll at certain time intervals. And again, this is the code of how you use it. You just copy and paste it into your own HTML and change the specifics to be, specific to your application. Dropdowns, super useful. I'm sure every website you've ever been to has had drop-down menus of some sort. You have buttons that combine with drop-downs. I use these a lot. I'm sure you've seen these on a bunch of websites. Drop up even, depending on where it is on the screen. I thought there was something else cool I wanted to show you. Anyways, drop-downs are really great. It would be a huge pain in the butt to code these by yourself and actually make them responsive and usable for all users, all devices. So Bootstrap provides that to you. I strongly recommend it. Second to last one is the modal. So a modal is basically just like a pop-up window that covers the rest of the content and requires you to make a decision before you can dismiss it. So this is kind of an example. There's a button and then a modal, which you cannot see currently. But when I click the button that is linked to the modal, it grays out my entire screen. And then this box appears on top. It also disabled scrolling. You can't see it, but I'm trying to scroll. It's doing nothing. So I don't have to write a whole lot of code. I just copy paste this into my code, but I get a lot of functionality just automatically. Like it grays out the whole screen, perfectly, stretched to the screen size, disables scrolling. It also makes it easy to dismiss. So by default, I can press escape to get out of it. I can click anywhere off of the screen to get out of this. A really common problem with homemade modals is that people will like block scrolling and block click events on the rest of the page, but then there's a bug and you can't dismiss the modal. Or like there's a very tiny button to dismiss the modal and it's like hard to click on or whatever. So I really like the Bootstrap modal because it has very good usability out of the box. Like it's hard to get trapped in it. Users can click away anywhere and it disappears by default. It's also very easy to style. So if you don't like exactly how it looks, you can apply your own styling to it to make it, match the style of your website, but still leverage all of the Bootstrap functionality, all of the JavaScript, the appearing and disappearing. Okay, but so best of all, this is the last one I'm going to talk about today, is the Nav Bar. Nav Bar in Bootstrap is so good. This is like so super useful. I would never want to build something like this myself. I mean, I guess I could do it, but it would probably not be as nice. Basically, building nav bars are a hard problem because you need the items to be spaced out and look pretty, but also for smaller screens, it needs to always be usable. So the main way that the Bootstrap nav bar does that is when there's not enough space for all the items after a certain breakpoint, it gives you this hamburger menu. That's what they call it, this button with the 3 horizontal lines. I guess if you really squint, kind of looks like a hamburger. So anything that doesn't fit in the nav bar automatically goes in here. Even drop downs are still accessible inside the hamburger menu. You don't have to write any extra code to make this happen like this. Just if you use the Bootstrap nav bar the way they tell you to use it, this is what you get for free. And then there's a few different versions of it. You can kind of mix and match some of the subcomponents, get some like different versions of the nav bar. Some nav bars have forms built into them. So you can kind of look through this, see what looks like something you want to use on your site, and then paste it in, change the specifics to match your site. But generally speaking, there are a lot of really useful components here in Bootstrap. They're going to probably work more efficiently and more consistently than anything you could build yourself. So I'd recommend you get comfortable with how to work with them, how to combine them with each other. So your homework for tonight actually is going to be just to use Bootstrap and implement the nav bar. So I hope you enjoy it because the Bootstrap nav bar is a really great component and it's really reliable, I think, if you know how it works. So that is everything I have for you in today's lecture. That is all I know about responsive web design. Does anybody have any questions before we break for today? Nothing? Everyone's an expert in responsive web design already. Perfectly absorbed all the lecture material from today. It's great. I'm glad that you're all such excellent listeners. Jen?
Well, there's a lot of stuff to learn today, but you said if we're gonna be struggling, you're gonna focus on the Bootstrap Grid. Is there anything else that you think are some key takeaways to focus on?
Key takeaways from today's lecture. I would say, for starters, remember that you need a responsive meta tag. So I showed you at the top of my HTML document. Why don't I just share again? So at the top of the HTML document, I have this responsive meta tag. If you don't have this, your site just will look ugly on phones. So you need this. If you don't know that this is what you're missing, it can be kind of hard to figure out what the problem is. So I think it's important that you know about this. I think it's kind of hard to Google, like, why is my website so small? So the responsive meta tag is important to know about. Just generally, the concepts of progressive enhancement versus graceful degradation are kind of things that an interviewer might ask you about. Like if you say you built a responsive website, they say, oh, can I ask you more about that? Did you build your responsive website primarily with progressive enhancement? or graceful degradation. And they might expect you to talk about that a little bit, your approach. And the compromises you have to make for different screen sizes. Breakpoint is a pretty common word you're going to hear a lot just in talking about CSS layouts. It's the point at which the layout changes. For the responsive units, I guess you don't have to use them, but they are pretty helpful. I think VH and VW are common enough. It's good to know what they do. I mean, again, you can live without using Rems, but I think they're useful. You can live without Flexbox, but I think any problem that you could solve with Flexbox would be much harder to solve without Flexbox. So I think Flexbox is also a good thing to study a bit. If you're trying to choose what to focus on, I would spend some time with Flexbox. I would probably experiment with that over playing with Ms and Rems, over playing with percents. I think Flexbox is good to be acquainted with. Definitely practice writing some media queries. Make sure you're able to do that and you know what they do, what problems they solve. And then make sure that you're able to use Bootstrap, at least in a basic sense. So again, that would be just really the grid system with these responsive classes here. Does that sound good? Does that leave you enough things to not focus on?
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, there's always too much to learn as a technologist, so you have to make decisions about what you're not going to study. All right, so no more questions for today. Going once, going twice. I don't believe we have any other activities scheduled for this afternoon, so you're free to just come back after lunch whenever and work on your exercise for the evening. So yeah, take care, folks.